Hello, welcome to Learn Plus. I'm Brenda Bailey Hughes. I'm so glad you are here today. This has been a hot topic. We were so excited about the sign up and how many of you are interested in talking about persuasion and influence, the different patterns of organization to use to get those messages across, and of course, to learn from Trent Deckard, one of these really cool exercises that he does, that if you're in training and development or if you're an educator, you're going to love this tool. It's incredibly flexible, and we both have been using it in a variety of contexts and having a great time with it and our learners. So welcome. As most of you know, I'm Brenda Bailey Hughes. I teach at the Kelley School of Business. I'm a teaching professor there, and I'm a LinkedIn author with over 10 courses in the library, some of which we'll highlight for you today as good supplements to what we will be talking about with my guest today. So our topic, persuasion, influence, I want you to think about that. We do it all the time, whether we realize it or not. We are in attempts to be influential with other people all the time. If you just scan your day, yesterday, today, and think about how often you are trying to influence others. And sometimes that's pretty overt influence. You're going in and you're asking for resources from your boss that you need to get your job done, or you're asking your direct reports to engage in some type of behavior that they wouldn't otherwise engage in. Or you're just trying to talk your friend into going to the movie that you want to see. We're in influential attempts all the time, it seems. And if we spend so much time influencing one another as part of our professional worlds, let's make sure that we're good at it, right? And the essence of leadership, and one of my favorite definitions of leadership, is getting things done through others. And that just means influence, influence, influence. So yeah, I see Kathleen is having a trouble with a link. We've got the brilliant Shelby Merriweather backstage who will be helping you with tech issues like that. So Kathleen, watch for a reach out from her. Demetra, welcome. So glad you're here. Yes, constructive conversation, you bet. Happy Monday. So glad you're here. What a way to kick off our week, right? Where are some of our other learners from today that are out there? We'd love to hear where you're from, and maybe what is one influential attempt, an influential effort you have on your calendar within the next few days? A conversation where you know you need to influence others, maybe a presentation that you're going to give, um, an email that you need to write. What is it you're trying to influence someone else to do? And be as vague as you need to protect confidentiality, of course, but I would love to hear what some of your examples are. Oh, we have Mubaina from Pakistan. Welcome. So glad you're here. Later this afternoon, I'm working with a group that is here in the Bloomington campus where I teach, that have all come over from a variety of Middle Eastern countries, and we're going to be working with them. Edmonton, Canada, great. Greece, oh, Dimitra, Tatiana's there right now, I think, unless she just left. She may be on her way home. Okay, great, Kathleen. I'm so glad that you made it in. Samir is looking for 3 important tips to be a good influencer. I promise you're going to get more than 3 before Trent's done with us today. More of the Greek crew there. Oh my goodness. There, Ellis from Greece. New Orleans. Okay, South Africa. Welcome. Luyanda from South Africa, Johannesburg specifically. Shakir also from Canada. We got Mexico and Mexico City represented. Massachusetts, Brazil, Dubai, Germany, Texas. That's great. Lima, New Hampshire, South Carolina, Istanbul, Turkey. It's been years, Demet, since I've been to Istanbul. What a beautiful, beautiful city. Westfield, Indiana. Oh, Chrissy, you're a homegirl for me. I am from Indiana as well. So good to have another Hoosier on board. Okay, so Sean's got something on Sunday that he needs to do to convince others to participate. So you've got some event and you need to get others engaged. Great. Oh, we've got Portugal, India, Virginia. Welcome. Cambridge, California, Bay Area. Yeah, Kathleen, glad you're here and glad you're representing for Cali. More Canada, more India. Pakistan says hi. Yes. Indianapolis. Thanks, JC. And your influence is lots of conversations with internal and external stakeholders. Okay, good. And one of the things we're going to be talking about today are two different approaches, and one that you might use with internal, one that you might use with external as you think it through. That'll be an interesting one to come back and revisit. All right, and the wonderful places that you're all from, keep drifting in. I love it. It's so great to see such a global community getting together to chat about how we influence. And in fact, all of this different cultural representation may end up being a part of how we approach influence. And I'll let Trent talk a little bit more about that. So let me introduce you to Trent Deckard. He is this brilliant faculty member at the Kelley School of Business at Indiana University, where we both teach in business communication related topics. Trent has undergrads in his classes every day, but he also does tons of executive coaching and executive education where he's working with business professionals like yourselves. He's one of my favorite colleagues to teach and to develop and design courses with. You're going to learn so much from Trent Deckard. So Trent, come on in and meet our amazing group. Hi, Trent. How are you?
I am great, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're all at. It's great to be with you all today. Thanks for having me, Brenda.
I'm so glad you're here. And Trent, especially compared to me right now, you're looking very tan. I think that the sunshine of your vacation you recently returned from gave you a healthy, sunny glow there, mister.
Thank you very much. Yeah, a lot of standing outside, being outside, and being with family, so it was great.
That's lovely. Did you do any influencing while you were on vacation?
I think we're always influencing, but I'm usually the recipient of a lot of influence. So I have some strong persuaders in my family that are always doing it too.
These strong persuaders are not even that old, and yet I've seen Facebook pictures of these young women in his life. I can imagine them being quite persuasive. That's great, Trent. So, well, if we switch from vacation mode to work setting, what are some of the times when you're coaching folks? What are some of the types of influence people are attempting or struggling with? When do they come to you seeking help with their influential attempts?
Well, many people are really struggling with seeing the influence that they're already doing or that they're already being exposed to. And that might be how they're interacting with coworkers and selling their credibility. It might be that idea that they really know, that they care about, but they're a little intimidated to offer to others and the opportunity to step forward. And so my point that I make to a lot of those folks that are struggling is that we are always in a perpetual state of being influencing, and really looking at that persuasion, not as this thing that other people do, but this thing that is among us and used by us at all times. And so everything from that presentation to, hey, we need to have a coffee policy in our break room because we don't do anything on that. Those things really matter in the long run.
I am all about a coffee policy. I'm ready. I'm ready. Let's have one for our break room. I think that space that we have, that we share, could be a really awesome space. But somebody's got to influence. I love it. That's great. And you can see in the comments, we're getting some info from people. For example, Layla from Algeria has the noble attempt of transmitting universal ideas about inclusion and respect to your students. What great work, Layla. That's awesome. How to influence my team to feel safe communicating with each other. Pam, awesome. We know how important psych safety is to a team and a team working well, performing well. So inspire, persuade, but always based in values and principles for you. Awesome. Yeah, that's great. Good. Okay. So Trent, one of the things I love is that you distinguish that there are times when influence seems like almost a one-shot deal. It's the presentation, and other times when influence feels like this sort of long ongoing campaign. Like I want my colleagues to see me as credible or trustworthy. And that's not a one-shot deal by any shape of the imagination. So I love how comprehensive your persuasion definition is there, the way you look at it.
Thank you. When I was working on my master's, I particularly got interested in persuasion and influence and all that was all around me. And the more I looked at it, the more I realized it was just we were just immersed in it nonstop. And we could either choose to say, hey, look, that's going on over there, and I don't take part in that. Persuasion is something else, or influences for other people, or we could jump in. And I always encourage people to get in on that, because they already are influencing, and that's never going to stop. It's going to be part of it. We can just learn how to do it better and to be more informed as we do it.
Yeah, I love that. So, all right. So you make a distinction. I've heard you talk about the differences between indirect and direct persuasion or influence. Can you tell me what does that mean to you, and what are some examples of indirect and direct influence?
Sure. I start my approach to influence and persuasion really based very closely with what Aaron Meyer writes about in the culture map. When we look at different types of audiences and their cultural basis, we have to recognize, as a colleague of mine put so well, that all cultures, all audiences are different, and different does not mean deficient. Different just means they're different, and we can approach that and respect it. And so with indirect influences or indirect persuasion, we have audiences where we might approach it with something that Aaron Meyer calls the applicate or the principle first concept, meaning that we're going to have to set up a little bit more on the theory. Here's the circumstances that are surrounding this, the problem, where we're located, and then maybe get into our solution. And some cultures, that's going to be more appropriate. Some audiences more appropriate. We also have direct influence, direct persuasion, and that's going to be for audiences where they expect a solution, or they are accustomed to having that solution out front, and then some supporting information behind it that backs up that argument. And in those cultures, they're not going to necessarily want to wait for that answer and hear that theory or the complexity of the issue. They want to know what's in this, what's happening, what are we doing here? And so those are kind of two differences. Both are very equal in that one is not more right than the other. They're just different approaches to use based on what our need is and what our audience really wants us to do.
When I think of indirect and direct communication, which is maybe more of a step removed from indirect and direct influence specifically, but I think of two people who just sort of operate on different radio wavelengths. We've got people that really read into context and nonverbal cues, and they're sensitive to the relationship and everything that's going on. And so they're kind of hearing messages that may or may not be really overt. And then you have other communicators whose style is much more, if you don't say it, I don't hear it. Say what you mean what you say, and they're just like really direct. And so is that similar to the kind of indirect and direct you're talking about, or are these two really different things?
Well, the key with what you're talking about is that the audiences are so different, and the audiences will use different mechanisms to read the room, read the air, as Aaron Meyer says in the culture map. And so the key that we can recognize is that different audiences will need different approaches to get to the end result. And so, for instance, in an indirect influence culture or audience, if we just come out with the solution, they're going to maybe think that's a little bit brash and maybe getting to the point. They want to know more about, how did you get to this? What was the rationale? What was the logic? And with a direct influence culture or audience, they're going to look at that and say, you've set up the background here very well, but I think I know where you're going with this, but I want to hear you say it. I want to hear that earlier. And they can almost anticipate that before it even comes out of the mouth of the speaker. And so, again, it's two different pathways to get to the end result. And it's always about getting the audience to accept that proposal or react to that proposal as it is at its face value.
Okay.
So, very complex.
Well, and it's really about audience analysis then, that know your audience. Are they going to respond more to an indirect influential attempt, or are they going to be more responsive to direct? And it doesn't really matter what my preference is as a communicator so much as what is going to be effective in this conversational style. We've got a great comment from Layla. She's reminding us that rhetorical theory is ethos, pathos, logos. Yes, Trent and I teach ethos, pathos, logos all the time. Ethos being credibility builds, logos being logical appeals, and pathos being emotional appeals. When we talk about direct, and then all of those, whether I'm trying to establish my credibility, my logic, or my emotional appeal, it's all dependent on the audience. So as Trent was just saying, even the organizational flow that I develop to establish my logic, to establish my credibility, to establish, to pull on your heartstrings a little bit and make sure that it's not all just head, but it's head and heart. All of that is dependent on the audience. And one really important factor to think about with our audience is, does an indirect approach resonate with them more than a direct approach? Sean, great question. What is too direct? What is that fine line that so many of us have to avoid? So when we know our audience, what is too direct? I love that, Sean. Any thoughts on that, Trent? How do we make sure that we know the audience well enough to know indirect is better? You mentioned culture, but what about culture would help me understand if this is likely to be an indirect or a direct audience? And what other factors play into analyzing my listener, whether that's a big group or just one person? How do I know the audience well enough what are the hints that I would need to know I should use an indirect or a direct approach?
Well, one of the things that I think that you've started with, and some of these questions are really getting to, is the fact that if we go into this process and we say, hey, look, I'm a really direct person and I can't flex to indirect, or I'm really a little bit more indirect and I can't do that, we're really negating the audience, and it's about the audience. I love talking about Aristotle, ethos, pathos, logos, because that really says, hey, look, we could get up and we could talk all day long, but it's really about the audience. And so if we center on that audience, the way to address this is to really observe our audience. What are we hearing from them? What are the decisions they talk about? We can talk to people that have worked with audiences, presented with audiences, been on teams with audiences, with global organizations. We certainly have more and more individuals connecting remotely, in person, you name it, who are experiencing really cross-cultural situations and learning about those differences. And we can kind of center on that. We will make mistakes because we always make mistakes, right? But as long as we are doing that good faith and that direct or indirect approach, kind of starts from that trial by error, we can start to adjust and really learn what audiences need. We can also have frank discussions. Hey, look, I come to this team meeting. Here's how I am. By the way, I tend to be a little bit more indirect. This is kind of where I come from. So just knowing that, let's all kind of share where we're at, what works best. How do we need to be more explicit or not so explicit when we talk?
I think a great example of that was actually setting this LinkedIn Live up. I emailed Trent, who I've worked with for years, so I know that he has a slightly more indirect approach maybe to communication, just from listening to how he influences. I can hear that indirectness in his tone sometimes, that indirectness in his approach. So I emailed him and I said, hey, would you like to do a LinkedIn Live with me? Here's a date. And he was like, no, I'm really sorry. I'm busy that day. And so then my very direct approach, like, I want to write back and go, okay, how about this other day? And then I thought, wait a minute, maybe that was the soft no, maybe that was his indirect way of telling me no, which I wanted to be respectful of. So I write back, I was like, okay, was that the indirect no, or do you really just want another date? And obviously he just wanted another date, because here we have him. But back to Sean's question, I think maybe one of the ways I could be too direct is if I were just to ignore the fact that maybe there was a soft no there and just keep pushing, like, okay, well, how about this date? And Trent says, oh no, on that date, I'm busy too. Okay, how about this date? That's one of the ways that if I were not listening for that indirect wavelength, Sean, I might miss it altogether and then be perceived as being too direct. So just knowing personality, because Trent and I are from very similar cultures. We were both raised in the US, Midwesterners no less. So we've got a lot of similar communication patterns, but we could still, even though culturally we're similar, we could still miss each other if I weren't paying attention to him and his approach to communication. And then I love what you said, and sometimes we're just going to make mistakes. So I think anytime we use culture as a good starting point, we have to realize that we're at risk of sort of stereotyping and stay very flexible so that, when I go to South Korea to teach, I do use a more indirect approach in my influence than I might here in the States, just because culturally I've been taught that that's a more indirect culture than what I grew up in. And yet there are some really direct students in South Korea and Seoul when I'm there, and I need to kind of flex for them, even though that's where they are. Shelby had popped a really interesting question that I want to make sure we don't miss. How do we do an audience analysis when our meetings or our classes are virtual? I think that's a great question. Thanks, Samir, for reminding us that so many of us are functioning remotely today. We don't necessarily, unless cameras are on, and even then it's a little trickier. It's hard to read those nonverbals that help us. But I think there are some other tricks of the trade that we could use to do a good audience analysis, even in a virtual context. Trent, what are some of the good ideas you use there?
Absolutely. Well, some of the things that we can do is we can really read up on an audience. We can explore different things. The culture map is always a good basis. We've got other online tools that you can use to figure out more about culture and audience, how decisions are made. And there's a whole set of things that can be really looked at. But we can still, beyond all that, we can connect with individuals that are leaders, coordinators, et cetera, to say what has worked well in the past. Good example, when Shelby and I were meeting earlier to talk about this session, I know we're talking a lot about how we got to this meeting. I said to Shelby, I said, what is something that people sitting in my guest chair do or do wrong that really don't help this whole effort? And she was very candid about, giving me some tips and suggestions. There is no shame in asking those questions, much like with Brenda's clarifying question to me. When we're trying to get that communication right, we can be very honest about that. Otherwise, I think what happens is we get very frustrated, or people storm off, or we don't answer things. And obviously, if our goal is to get whatever it is we're seeking to influence on, and sometimes these are really great projects, if our goal is to get that done, we may never get it done because, look, we're just not connecting, we're not meeting, et cetera. And that's frustrating for everyone on all sides.
Yeah. So when we don't know an audience, and I see one of our listeners had asked, well, you don't even know the audience, make some calls. Who are the organizers of the event? Somebody had to invite you to be there. Tap into that person's wisdom about the audience to do at least some initial gathering of information, to have some sense of who it is we're talking to, what they might be like. I'm reminded of a great tip from the great business communicator Warren Buffett, who talks about when he writes a shareholder's report, he can't know every single shareholder and how they think and what communication style they use and how much they know. So he says something like, well, I just think of my sister, I can't remember his sister's name, Bertie, let's say. I think of my sister Bertie, and I write to my shareholder as though I'm writing to Bertie, because Bertie is not a financial wizard, but she is a smart gal. So he starts with this sort of generalized information. He can guess that a shareholder in his company is maybe not a financial expert, but is a well-read, an educated, intelligent human being. Talk to them like that and substitute in sort of a persona that can stand in for them. I think that's one of the reasons that personas in design thinking, a problem-solving methodology based in empathy, is so effective, is that then always in front of us, we have that sort of archetypal user. I know that when I'm designing classes, Trent, and I'm trying to think, how will this activity influence my students? How will this activity resonate with their knowledge level? I tend to have flip charts around my office that have these personas of different students. This is this is what my student who's a freshman and living in the dorm might be experiencing. And here's my international student and so those are a helpful way perhaps to do some audience analysis, even when we don't know the audience specifically. These are great questions, everybody. Pamela, great. I want to go to Pam's question real quick. If you have a small audience and one person shuts down while everybody else is like going for it, how do you continue to keep everyone engaged? I'll let Trent think about that while I throw out what initially comes from me. In terms of knowing our audience, and I think Tatiana and I have talked a little bit about this. We've got a class on introversion and extroversion. We know that the introverted processors process internally. So when that person is shutting down, it may be simply that, and I'm one of these people, I don't do my best thinking in the heat of the moment. When everybody else is heatedly discussing, I'm listening, and I can't really formulate my own thought enough to get involved and engaged in the conversation. So giving me pre-work, an agenda ahead of time so that I've already had time to think through some of my ideas with some really pointed questions, Pamela, that's been really helpful to me to stay engaged. And then to always build in incubation time so that those folks who are internally processing during the meeting, the decision's not made at the end of the meeting. We can say, okay, well, here is the idea we're leaning towards. We're actually going to table decision until the next time we meet, or we're going to do a poll vote online after the meeting, so that if anyone has any additional thoughts, you can get those to the groups through writing between now and the vote or the decision moment. So Pamela, hopefully those are some ideas that will help you with the person shutting down. Trent, did you have any other thoughts for that?
I would add that you can also really allow for that opportunity where they can follow up later with some written feedback. Some of us we're going to be more written based or writing based. The other thing that, if you also wanted to just survey audience attitudes before you get into a setting, you can always survey them right before you start, a couple weeks out. Hey, what's on your mind? If I were to talk to you today about such and such topic, would that be something that's, scale 0 to 10 important to you in your function in our organization? All those things can be approaches that really allow people to reach different things. And the last thing I would just add is different audiences are going to show different things on their face and with their nonverbals. And sometimes those mean things. And sometimes, unfortunately, they just mean they're being quiet. They're listening to people fight because they're not so sure that maybe they want to engage at that point, and they'll give you fruitful information later. Take confidence from that reality that you do belong in the room. You're doing a great job. We want to hear your influence, and you got to keep going even when it gets a little awkward.
I love that. Yeah, thank you. I want to make sure that we talk about some patterns of organization, but I had one more thought. You mentioned earlier that some people are kind of resistant to this idea of, or we kind of shut down and we say, well, I can't be indirect because that's not me. I am direct, or I can't be direct because I'm just indirect. And that's not really, that's sort of discounting our audience is how you put it. And I love that. I think a great follow-up for people in that space is Professor Hermione Ibarra, Ibarra's work. If you just Google her, she's got some great TED Talks, or she's written The Authenticity Paradox. And so she talks about this idea that if I just claim, well, I'm a direct person, and so that's all I can be is direct, well, and I'm just being authentic, she says, I think we're stretching the definition of authenticity beyond its true bounds. Because she said, when you say, if you define authenticity as being true to myself, well, one, why is myself more important than my audience? So that's what Trent has made me think about today. But also, Ibarra talks about this idea that when I say, well, I'm being true to myself, she says, which self? Your self of yesterday, your self of today, or the self that you're trying to grow into being? I want to grow into being a communicator that has lots of tools in my toolkits, lots of flexibility to make my listener, to accommodate my listener as best I can, to flex and be the right communicator for the person standing in front of me instead of the right communicator for who I was raised to be. And that means I'm growing into someone that maybe I haven't always been. So check out The Authenticity Paradox. I think it's really relevant and just a great great concept as well. Okay, we got to get to this because I want to make sure we get to the Learn Plus, where we're going to teach you Trent's awesome tool. But first, Trent, if we've decided, because of culture, because of personality, because of my audience analysis, when I've paid attention to how you make decisions and how you communicate, for whatever reason, I've decided this conversation needs to be direct, or this conversation needs to be more indirect. How do I go about organizing my ideas so that I've got the right, I mean, I get it that, I mean, you've established that essentially it's like start with the recommendation up front and then the rationale, but beyond that, are there tips you would give us to help us organize our train of thought so that when we've made that choice, I want to be direct, I want to be indirect, I think it's best for my audience, what does that look like, practically speaking?
That's a really great question. It's one where audiences, or where speakers and communicators, they often really get astray. And that is not using an organization pattern. A lot of times we think, well, I need for all my knowledge to come out and all my wisdom and all my experience and everything, and I've only got 5 minutes to present.
That's right.
And that's a disaster.
Or as Samir just asked, or I have no time to prep, but I got to get it all organized and all concise. How do I do that when I get no prep time? Yeah.
Completely. And we, as Samir has pointed out, we are in a world that does not really allow for prep. And my argument to speakers are an outline system, an organizational system that really captures how we are reacting to a problem, to a pitch need, or really an organizational demand. How we react to that using either direct or indirect is key. And for direct, I'm going to always tend to recommend a Mentos recommendation sequence. It's going to have a what to it, a why, a how. We might start it with a situation, complication, question, answer to set up briefly, very briefly, what we're talking about. But I'm going to stick to that core what, why, how to explain really to direct audiences what I'm talking about. For an indirect audience, I might use a Monroe sequence, which has not always been associated with indirect audiences. But really, if you look at it, it gets your attention around a problem, sets the scene up for that problem, and then starts to get into solution, how the organization might buy in. And you can flex that around to really reach more indirect cultures or audiences based on what they want. You could even use a Monroe's motivated sequence to start a conversation at a organizational level about, hey, look, what do we want to do on this problem? Here are some ideas. How do we refine those ideas or make a decision here? And so the key is that you have that pattern. The biggest thing I hear, Brenda, from employers and folks that are out there making these key decisions, I call them deciders, is that they want to hear the idea. They want to know that there's something coming related to that idea, if it's an indirect approach, so that they can make a decision about it. They have a lot of headaches in a day that they're trying to get to and manage, and they can't get to this one if they can't get to the point of whatever you're talking about.
I think one of the reasons getting to that direct pattern, or as you called it, Mentos, Mintos, you can all do some research on Mentos. That's a whole cottage industry of Barb Mento that has put that together. But I think it's a struggle for people to get there because it's counterintuitive to the way we go about reaching a decision. When we're decision making, we go out and we identify the problem and we do all this research and we gather all the data. And then after we've gathered all the data, we analyze all that data, and then we reach a decision or to a point that we can make a recommendation. And then when you talk about the direct approach, it just flips all of that on its head, because you're saying start with the recommendation, then tell me a little bit about the analysis, why you decided that was a good recommendation, spatter in enough of the data that you went out and collected that you support it, and then tell me how to do it. So the what, why, how is just, and instead we want a chronology, we want to use a chronological approach where I say, well, first we did this, and then we did that, and then we did this. And a lot of direct thinkers and decision makers don't really care about my process of discovery. They just want to know, what's the recommendation? Why is that a good recommendation? Why is that what I should do? How are we going to do it? Yeah, I love that.
And many times those deciders, they sort of know the what of what you're going to be offering. They're going to walk in here with this solution, but they may not have thought about the whys fully. They may not have also got to a decision point, and you might be the nudge that brings them along. I always say deciders didn't get into the chair they're in by not knowing a lot of answers to things or anticipating what people walking in are going to say to them. So leaning into that, let's get to the point with those direct audiences and really say, hey, look, this is what we're offering today. And I'm going to tell you a little more why about that and some more how we get that done.
So some of you had written to us in the comments a specific influential event that you have coming up. If you look at that audience and you decide, you know what, I think I need to use a direct approach with this particular audience, culturally, personality wise, the way I've noticed their own communication attempts, because people try to influence us the way they want to be influenced themselves or the way they would be influenced. So I've paid attention enough. I know them enough. I'm going to use a direct approach. Think about what that would look like. What would your what be? What would your why be? And what would your how be? So Trent, we didn't tell them what all those bookshelves are behind you. So they are comic books. Trent is an avid comic book collector and reader. So Trent, using Mentos, using what, why, how, can you convince me, a non-comic book reader, look, no comic books on the shelves, you use what, why, how right now to convince me to read comic books. And that way they can see what, why, how in action. Go.
We need sources of inspiration, creativity, and literature that drive people's imagination. Comic books do that. Comic books are a growing industry. Comic books are huge. And when people read comic books, literary skills grow, creativity flies off the wall, and they get huge collections. And so here's how you get started. You get you a long box, Brenda, and you do that the next 3 months. And over a year, you're going to get up to about one of those shelves. And then the risk of that is you're going to be out a little bit of money. But look, the growth that you're going to have is going to offset that risk.
I love it. Brilliant. I love it. Okay, now if we wanted to use an indirect approach, if Trent knows me and he thinks, boy, Brenda is kind of an indirect speaker, I think I want to use this Monroe's motivated sequence. Again, you can all Google it for some follow-up. But Trent, tell us what the components are of Monroe's, and then maybe demonstrate convincing me to read a comic book if you decided to use a more indirect approach.
All right. So Monroe's is going to have an attention step where you bring the audience's attention in, need, talking about the problem that's being addressed, satisfaction, which is your solution. Here's what we're offering, visualization, which lets us dream about that solution, and then action step. Here's how we get started. And so
Trent, one of the ways I learned to remember those parts, attention was, hey, you, need was, you've got an itch, satisfaction was, which I can scratch, call to action, or what you say, satisfaction, what's your fourth?
Visualization.
And then you're going to feel so good if you'll take this action. So that's it. That was, hey, you've got an itch, which I can scratch. Then you'll feel really good if you do this. That's how I learned Monroe's.
You nailed it.
Okay, so convince me to get into comic books using Monroe's motivated sequence. I just totally put him on the spot, by the way, with this. We hadn't talked about it, but to his point, this is the beauty of having these sort of turnkey organizational patterns that even when someone just calls you out on the fly to make some sort of recommendation, you've got it. And think about how quickly and concisely he made that clear argument in a direct pattern for me to become, and it was really well audience tailored too. He knew creativity speaks to me. He knows that's a high value or priority for me. He knew inspiration was important to me. So man, we just saw a great demonstration, Trent, of audience analysis and the direct approach. Let's hear indirect.
Do you think that you have been working too hard? Do you think that all your free time is a little bit boring at times? Are you tired of flipping through more and more streaming shows that you feel like are sucking you into the TV? And do you want a hobby that will draw you in and allow you to retain some value with the things that you add to your shelves of life? I want to talk to you today about why the comic book industry, and comic books specifically may be that thing that you're looking for. Comic books satisfy that creative need that you have, and comic books amass value when collected and allowed for a lot of time, lots of time. And when you read comic books, you're able to go on adventures around the world. It's not just superheroes anymore. There's mysteries, detectives, romance comics, you name it. And so as you go around that world, you can get started today. You can visit your local comic book store. You can order them online. You can even read them online and never have them physically. It's whatever device you need. Comic books reach you at that point.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you. I feel like, Shelby, we should get a sponsor and it should be a comic book publisher after this great episode on live. No, that's funny. Okay. Listeners, we promised you Learn Plus. The Plus is a great strategy for teaching others how to use these direct and indirect influential attempts. So if you're coaching your own team on, hey, maybe we should practice this, or if you're a trainer and you're going to be in a classroom teaching influential attempts, I'd love for Trent to talk to you about this exercise that he uses, and you call it the exchange. Tell us about the exchange and how you came up with the name for exchange.
Well, I went through a few different names, but ultimately I landed on the exchange because I wanted something that really told people what we're doing. And that is, we're taking, similar to what I just did, we're taking some organizational structure that we can learn, whether that's Monroe's motivated sequence, Mentos for recommendations, or even putting together a good story using Freitag's pyramid. I wanted to take some structure, any structure really would work, and allow people to outline very quickly some things they wanted to put together for a quick pitch. And once they had done that outline, I wanted something that they could then go around into a room of peers and get feedback and talk about the idea and really get more comfort and confidence as a presenter. And that's how the exchange was born in one of my classrooms. And I appreciate all the students that contributed to this effort because it changed over time. But ultimately, that growth that we get from that is still always there each time I do it.
I want you all to know I have stolen the exchange from Trent and used it in a variety of courses and training and development events that I've done, that I've led, and I just love this. I call it the wagon wheel instead of the exchange because I'm so visual. It gives me this visual. So let's explain what it is, and then I can share how I've used it. Trent can give you an example. So the wagon wheel has a hub and a wheel, the concentric circles. We've got people standing in a circle inside, and then more people standing on the outside of that circle facing each other. So there are these dyads in these circles, right?
Absolutely.
And then Trent, your prompt is something like,
I might say, hey, look, what is it we want to pitch on today using Monroe's motivated sequence? And then we're going to quickly take whatever it is that we're making the pitch on. We're going to argue, or we're going to put that into an outline form using the sequence. We're going to use very simple phrases that reflect what will go onto that outline. And once we're done with that, we're going to divide that room into ones and twos to determine who goes on the outside of the wagon wheel or the exchange and who goes on the inside. And then we quickly move to that. All that takes place in about no more than about 10 to 15 minutes, actually.
All right, so in 10 minutes, I've kind of got my pitch in my mind very quickly because I have an organizational structure and it doesn't take forever once you do it. Now I'm a 1 or a 2. What happens next?
So we're going to be in those circles, and here's what's going to happen. For a minute and a half, ones, you're going to pitch to the 2 about that outline. So you'll go through Monroe's motivated sequence. Here's my attention step, or you might just say, hey, have you ever blah, 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 and just jump into that attention step. Need, satisfaction, visualization, and action. And you'll go through that for 1 minute and a half. While you're doing that, the 2s or the listeners, they're going to be listening. They're going to be thinking about, does this work? Is this clear? What feedback can I offer? And then they're going to have a minute and a half to give feedback to that one that just presented. When that's all wrapped up, 2s, you'll take a minute, clear your head, and you're going to pitch yours using that sequence. And 1s, you're going to listen and you'll give feedback. And Brenda, the best part of this is when we're done with the exchange and that couple pair there, we're going to move those 1s one space to the right. We're going to do it all again. And we'll do that over and over, making notes and adjusting as we go, maybe debriefing a couple times. We'll do that as people get more comfortable with the pitch they have literally developed about 25 minutes ago based on this practice. And it works so well.
So well. It's so iterative in that I practice. So instead of just thinking about it or talking about it, they're actually doing it. They're giving the pitch. They're getting fast feedback right there on the fly. Here's just genuine feedback from their partner. And then boom, switch to a new partner and play it all over again so that you get even better feedback, better questions in response to your second attempt. It builds on so many great educational principles. So when I stole the wagon wheel, the exchange from Trent, the first time I used it, I actually had this long list of design thinking tools that I wanted people to learn, but I didn't want to just lecture on them. So all of you in T&D and learning and development, long lectures are like classroom death. And so instead, I just gave students a tool, a definition of a tool, and one example of when you might use this kind of design thinking tool. And then my prompt, when I got them into the 1s and 2 groups, the concentric circles, I said, tell your partner, describe the tool to them so that they understand what it is, and tell them one example of when you might use it that is different than the one on your card. And then listeners, you can ask questions about what you didn't understand about the tool or how you would use it, and share one more example of when you would use it. And so then again, they would go back and forth, and then they would switch. And so again, like Trent said, in 25, 30 minutes, my students were exposed to up to 10, 15 tools, one of which they knew so well because they had explained it 8 or 9 times by the time we rotated a few times. And each time they were getting feedback through I don't understand this about it, or, oh, here's when I would use it. So they've got all these ideas of when they would use it. What I loved about the exercise was this was a 3-day seminar that I was teaching. In day 2 and 3, whenever students would talk, they would say, well, my tool was blah, blah, blah. And it was like they owned the tool that they had used in the wagon wheel, the exchange. It was theirs. So there was this really embodied kind of learning that I just loved. Yeah,
absolutely.
That's the exchange. And for our T&D folks out there, I think this is a great tool for so many different topics. When you want people to practice, you want iterative exposure to an idea, or you have a long list and you don't want to lecture it out, here's a very different way, an experiential way to teach those tools. So I hope they have a good time with the exchange. Trent, anything else about the exchange we need to tell them?
One thing, if you have people that are a little bit, hesitant to come up with their idea, a lot of times what happens if they've got a blank spot in their outline, the feedback audience will say, oh, have you ever thought about this? Or maybe your idea needs this. You could use this for so many different learning tools and tactics to really get people to engage and have fun with it, make variations, do what you will. I hope you enjoyed as much as we have.
We love it. And so we really hope that's a good one for you. So the exchange, for those of you wanting a new tool for your training and coaching experiences, a lot of great tips from Trent. Thank you so much, Trent, for your tips on communication and influence, specifically indirect and direct. If you want some follow-up information, I know Tatiana and I have a course called Communication Foundations. It's a longer course, but there are at least 3 videos in that course. So just little 3 to 5 minute videos if you're trying to keep your time on videos short these days, that specifically speak to influence. One was called Pitching Ideas. One was When You're Asking for Something. And a third one is called Presenting Up. So when you're asking someone that's above you on the chain of command for something, how do you do that? How do you present up? And at least here in North America, as Trent's been teaching, when we're presenting up, we will frequently want to use that direct approach. So lots of good tips, lots of follow-up for all of you. We put some of those other links. I've seen Shelby's giving you some links in the comments. Trent, thank you so much for being here. I love talking about the exchange. I love talking about influence with you.
It was so good to be with you. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. Everybody, as Michelangelo said, at the ripe old age of 87, I'm still learning. Let's all keep learning. Thank you for being here today and have a great day.